The chaos erupted just before 2 a.m. on March 1, 2026, outside of Buford's Backyard Beer Garden on Austin's West Side 6th Street. An SUV circled the crowded patio multiple times before stopping. Gunfire erupted from the vehicle toward people on the patio and sidewalk. Then the driver exited to continue firing with a pistol and rifle. 2 patrons died. 14 others were wounded, 3 critically, and officers ended the threat by fatally shooting the gunman. This is Ndiaga Diagne, a 53-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen from Senegal. He arrived in 2000 on tourist visa and became a permanent resident through marriage in 2006 and gained citizenship in 2013. Neighbors described him as friendly, and authorities that recovered a Quran from his vehicle noted a sweatshirt reading "Property of Allah" and an undershirt with an Iranian flag design, and found photos of Iranian regime leaders at his home. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force joined early, citing indicators suggesting a potential terrorism nexus, though officials note it's too early for a confirmed motive. As a licensed professional counselor since 2007, I'm still seeing clients full-time, and it's my everyday clinical work that shapes how I look at cases on the clinical file. This analysis is based purely on my speculations. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved. No judgment, no sensationalism, just trying to trace the psychological patterns and quiet warning signs that build over time. Another case, another clinical file. The investigation continues exploring possible ideological influences, with no final motive determined as of March 2026. The symbolic clothing and materials raise questions about how radicalization can intersect with personal vulnerabilities to produce violence against strangers. Radicalization often develops gradually. Exposure to extremist content, identification with a perceived victim group, or moral disengagement that justifies harm, and it's also a growing belief in the need for action. Diagne's reported history of emotional disturbance in New York and Texas, plus prior arrest. Some are sealed for non-violent issues like illegal vending from early 2000s to 2016, and a vehicle incident in Texas in 2022. These suggest periods of instability. These don't indicate chronic violence, though, but they do point to challenges in managing emotions consistently. Emotional dysregulation can make intense ideological messages more appealing, especially during feelings of disconnected or injustice. After decades in the U.S., achieving citizenship and community ties unresolved alienation or marginalization might have built up. Immigration involves lasting adaptation stress. Securing stability is a major step, yet ongoing difficulties can foster resentment or identity fragmentation. Radical ideologies sometimes provide a sense of purpose, belonging, and an outlet for anger. The attack demonstrated a premeditated and intent for broad impact. Circling repeatedly, stopping deliberately, firing from the vehicle, then continuing with an assault rifle all indicate planning and a drive for visibility. Selecting a busy nightlife area full of strangers often reflects a displaced rage, victims as proxies for a larger enemy. Dehumanization occurs here, selectively disabling empathy for those viewed as a part of an opposing group, a pattern seen in ideologically influenced violence. Compartmentalization probably enabled the outward contrast. Neighbors saw a polite man, daily life seemed routine, but internally, grievances, ideological alignments, and emotional pressures may have remained constrained. But internally, grievances, ideological alignments, and emotional pressures may have remained contained until a trigger overwhelmed those divisions. The worn and carried items weren't random. They likely reflected a worldview that contextualized distress within a larger conflict. Moral disengagement facilitates such acts like this. By redefining violence as a defense of a principle, minimizing harm's significance, or blaming broader systems, internal restraints weaken. The symbolic elements suggest narratives framing the act as justified rather than random. For comparison, consider the February 2026 case of Dawson Maloney, a 23-year-old Albany Law School student who drove from New York to Nevada. I covered this recently in one of my videos. He rammed a rental car through a gate at a power substation near Boulder City and died by self-inflicted gunshot. Authorities found weapons, explosives, and extremist literature expanding right-wing, left-wing, white supremacist, and anti-government ideologies in his vehicle and hotel room. He messaged family beforehand, referring to himself as a dead terrorist's son and expressing obligation to act, with statements about self-harm and making national news. Like Diagne's case, it involved symbolic ideological materials, potential self-radicalization, and an act treated as terrorism-related, highlighting how personal distress can blend with eclectic extremist views to push toward destructive behavior, though Maloney's ended in suicide rather than lethal confrontation. Connecting these aspects, emotional history, ideological markers, methodical execution, and grievance-based justification suggests an inner world increasingly dominated by resentment and rationalization. When alignments intensified, controls likely failed. Here are the key mental health psychological indicators I speculated from reported patterns in this video. Emotional dysregulation, trouble managing strong emotions, increasing openness to extreme narratives under stress. Identity fragmentation, challenges with belonging after prolonged immigration and adaptation, potentially deepening alienation. Compartmentalization, separating conflicting self-parts to maintain normal external functioning despite internal conflict. Moral disengagement, cognitive reframing that permits harm by justifying it as necessary or righteous. Radicalization, a progressive embrace of extremist ideas heightened by unresolved personal struggles. If examining these potential overlaps of vulnerability and ideology clarified how subtle escalations can culminate in tragedy, I love to keep providing these insights. Subscribe if you want the next breakdown in your next feed. It's free, it's quick, and it lets us continue exploring the psychological dimensions of these events together. The absence of personal ties to victims points to an expressive cause-linked motive over individual revenge. Strangers became symbols where broad rage overrode personal humanity. The ongoing investigation will probably provide further clarity here, but this combination of behaviors underscores how mental health factors and ideological influence can sometimes align in destructive ways. Here we have a case that's a lot of rage, a lot of ideology, radicalization, a lot of probably some paranoia. So what did you think about the Ndiaga Diagne's case? Were any of the psychological dynamics or potential radicalization patterns particularly striking to you? And that closes another clinical file. Until next time, keep looking a little deeper, stay curious, and stay safe. If I butcher another name this badly, just assume I'm pronouncing it in therapist code for complex human being.